Jesus, why is she sleeping here? The words slipped out before Daniel Carter could stop them. And the second they did, he brought his hand up and covered his own mouth, eyes moving quickly back to the small figure on the sofa, as if the sound might still wake her. She didn't move. He stood there for a moment, just listening to the quiet. The office was dim, lit only by the lamp near the sofa and the gray-blue light of a rainy Manhattan evening pressing softly against the glass walls. A little girl was sleeping on his sofa, clutching a large sheet of paper to her chest so tightly that the edges were bent and wrinkled from the pressure. Daniel quietly walked back to the door and pushed it closed until it almost clicked, stopping it just before the latch caught. Then he loosened his tie and slipped off his suit jacket. He walked toward the sofa slowly. He gently laid his jacket over her, pulling it up to her shoulders so she wouldn't get cold. She stirred a little and tightened her arms around the paper. Daniel noticed how tightly she was holding it. "What do you have there?" he murmured quietly. He carefully slid one corner of the paper free and looked down. 3 people stood under a bright yellow sun. A little girl, a woman, and a tall man in a dark suit. The 3 of them were holding hands in front of a tall building with many windows. Above the tall figure were written the words in careful uneven letters. Mr. Daniel stared at the drawing for a long moment, then let out a soft breath. "Well," he whispered, "I didn't see that coming." He sat down very slowly on the edge of the sofa beside her, careful not to wake her. The cushion dipped slightly under his weight. Annie shifted in her sleep and without opening her eyes, her small hand moved across the cushion until it found his hand. Her fingers curled around his automatically. Daniel froze and looked down at her hand holding his. After a moment, he slowly turned his hand and held hers gently, his large hand completely wrapping around her small one. Annie's face relaxed, and she mumbled softly in her sleep. "Mom." A small pause. "Mr. Daniel, wait." Her fingers tightened around his hand like she was afraid he might leave. Daniel swallowed, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered very quietly. "You can sleep. I'll stay here." She settled again, breathing slow and deep, still holding his hand, still holding the drawing with her other arm. A few minutes later, the door opened quickly. "Sir, I'm so sorry. She was just drawing. I didn't know she fell asleep on your couch." Laura Bennett stopped in the doorway when she saw them. Annie asleep under Daniel's jacket. Daniel sitting beside her, their hands still loosely connected. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter," Laura said quickly, stepping forward. "Annie, baby, wake up. You can't sleep here." Daniel gently raised his free hand to stop her. "It's okay," he said softly. "Don't wake her." Laura hesitated. "But sir, she shouldn't be." He shook his head slightly and looked down at Annie again. "Let her sleep," he said. "She must have been very tired. Looks like she worked very hard on that drawing." Laura followed his gaze to the paper still tucked under Annie's arm. Her chest tightened a little. "She draws when she's trying to figure things out," Laura said quietly. "She thinks better with a crayon in her hand." Daniel nodded slightly, like he understood more of that sentence than she expected. Laura stood there, unsure whether to leave or stay, unsure what the right thing to do was in a room that suddenly didn't feel like an office anymore. Daniel looked down again, and that's when he noticed her shoes. She was still wearing them, one sneaker half off her heel, the other still tied, the laces a little messy. He frowned slightly and murmured under his breath, almost to himself, "You can't sleep with your shoes on, kid." Laura started to say something, maybe that she would take them off, but Daniel had already leaned forward carefully. Very gently, he lifted Annie's foot and untied the lace slowly so the shoe wouldn't pull. He slipped the small sneaker off and set it quietly on the floor, then did the same with the other one. His hands were large and careful, the hands of a man used to signing contracts and shaking hands, now removing tiny shoes as if this were the most normal thing he had ever done. Laura watched without speaking, something warm and painful pressing behind her ribs. After he set the shoes neatly beside the sofa, Daniel looked at Annie for a long second. Then, without thinking too much about it, he reached out and gently brushed a few loose braids away from her forehead and rested his hand lightly on the top of her head. He gave a small absent-minded stroke, the way someone might calm a child without waking them. But Annie stirred, her eyebrows moved slightly, and her eyes slowly opened. For a second, she looked confused, caught between a dream and a glass office in the sky. Then she saw Daniel sitting beside her, his hand still resting lightly on her head, his jacket around her shoulders. Her eyes widened. Daniel immediately pulled his hand back slightly, not far. Just enough so she wouldn't feel trapped. "Hey," he said quietly. "You're okay. You didn't do anything wrong." Annie blinked up at him, then looked down at his jacket around her, then at her shoes on the floor, then at the drawing still in her arms. "You took my shoes off." she asked in a small sleepy voice. Daniel nodded once. Yeah, you looked uncomfortable. She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, the way children studied adults when they were deciding whether to trust them. Then she held the drawing up a little and asked very seriously, "Did you see it?" Daniel looked at the drawing, then back at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "I saw it." She searched his face. "Are you mad?" He shook his head. "No, I'm not mad." She seemed to think about that, then nodded once, satisfied, and leaned back into the sofa, still holding the picture. Laura finally found her voice. "Annie, sweetheart, we need to go home." Annie looked at her mom, then back at Daniel, then down at the drawing again. Daniel stood slowly and picked up her small sneakers, setting them gently beside her within reach. "You can finish your nap next time," he said, "but maybe without the shoes." Annie nodded very seriously, like this was an important business agreement. "Okay, Mr. Daniel." He looked at Laura then, his voice quiet again, thoughtful. "I canceled a meeting so she could sleep," he said. Laura blinked, surprised. "You canceled a meeting?" He nodded once and glanced back at Annie. "I think," he said slowly, "anyone who holds on that tight to a drawing like that probably needed the rest." Laura didn't know what to say, so she just held her daughter's hand and nodded. The next morning, Annie woke up before her alarm because she remembered the couch. She also remembered that Mr. Daniel had taken off her shoes like it was a normal thing for a very important man to do. "Mom," Annie said, sitting up in their small apartment in Queens, her hair slightly wild from sleep. "Do rich people always take off your shoes when you fall asleep?" Laura, who was pouring coffee into a chipped white mug, paused mid-pour and looked at her daughter. "No," she said, "they definitely do not." Annie thought about that seriously. Okay, so maybe just him. Their apartment was small but clean. The kind of place where everything had a place because there was no room for things that didn't. The kitchen table was also Annie's drawing table, and sometimes Laura's work desk when she brought paperwork home. A small plant sat by the window, one that Annie was in charge of watering, and Laura was in charge of keeping alive. When Annie forgot, Laura set a plate of toast in front of Annie. "You can't wander around that building like that again," she said gently. "That's Mom's workplace, not a playground." "I know," Annie said. "I was going to the bathroom and then I saw his door and I remembered I forgot to draw the building windows, so I went in to finish." Laura closed her eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like something her daughter would do. "You scared me yesterday," Laura said quietly. Annie looked down at her toast. "I didn't mean to." "I know." Laura sat down across from her. "But you can't just fall asleep in the CEO's office." Annie looked up. "He wasn't mad." "No," Laura said softly. "He wasn't." Annie chewed her toast for a moment, then said, "He looks less scary when he whispers." Laura almost choked on her coffee. "He what?" "He whispers when he talks near sleeping people," Annie said. "So they don't wake up scared." Laura didn't know what to say to that, so she reached over and wiped a little jam from the corner of Annie's mouth. "You really like him, don't you?" Laura asked. Annie shrugged in the way children did when the answer was obvious. "He looks like he eats lunch alone." Laura felt something twist in her chest at that sentence. But she didn't ask how Annie knew that. Annie noticed things. Too many things sometimes. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from because we would love to hear your story, too. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that reminds us what kindness really means. That morning when Laura and Annie arrived at Carter Capital, Annie held Laura's hand a little tighter than usual in the elevator. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, Annie looked down the long hallway toward the big office at the end, but didn't say anything. "You're staying with Mrs. Green in reception today," Laura told her. "And you are not going exploring." "I'm not exploring," Annie said. "I'm just looking with my feet sometimes." Laura gave her a look. Annie gave her a small smile. They both knew that was not a real promise. Around 11 that morning, Daniel Carter stepped out of a conference call and walked down the hallway toward the reception area. He had a folder in one hand and his phone in the other, reading something that probably involved numbers with too many zeros. He stopped when he heard a familiar small voice. "Mrs. Green, do you think he likes peanut butter?" Daniel looked up. Annie was sitting in one of the big chairs in reception, her legs sticking straight out because they didn't reach the floor. She had a piece of paper on her lap and a purple crayon in her hand. Mrs. Green, who had worked in that building longer than most of the partners, was looking at Annie like she had known her for years. "I don't know, baby," Mrs. Green said. "I never asked him. I think he forgets to eat sometimes." Annie said, "Yesterday he had coffee at night." "That's not dinner." Daniel stood there for a second before either of them noticed him. Mrs. Green looked up first. Mr. Carter, she said, a small smile forming. Good morning. Annie turned around in the chair so fast she almost slid off. Oh, hi, Mr. Daniel. There was a very small pause, the kind that meant something but didn't say what. Hi, Annie, he said. She held up the paper in her hand. I'm drawing the windows again. I forgot some yesterday. He nodded once. It's a lot of windows. Yes, she said, seriously. I think your building might be greedy. Mrs. Green coughed to hide a laugh. Daniel looked at Annie for a long second, then nodded slightly. That's a fair assessment. Annie seemed pleased that he agreed. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in foil. I brought 2 sandwiches today, she said. In case you forget lunch again. Daniel looked at the sandwich, then at her, then at Mrs. Green, who suddenly found something very interesting on her desk and refused to be part of this conversation. You brought me a sandwich? He asked. Annie nodded. Peanut butter and jelly. It fixes a lot of problems. Daniel slowly took the sandwich like it was something much more important than it should have been. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, Annie replied. Then she leaned a little closer and lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret. You look less tired today. He almost smiled. Laura watched this entire interaction from the hallway. A folder pressed against her chest, unsure whether she was witnessing something wonderful or something that was going to make her life much more complicated. Later that afternoon, Daniel called Laura into his office. She walked in carefully, the way people did when they were called into powerful rooms, and closed the door behind her. You wanted to see me, sir. Daniel was standing near the window, looking out over the city. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Laura, he said finally, still looking out at the rain-streaked glass. Do you remember the year the company went under? Laura's fingers tightened slightly around the folder she was holding. Yes, she said quietly. I remember. Most people don't stay when tea. No, Laura replied. They don't. He walked back to his. Laura looked up at him then. And for the first time since she had started working for him, she did not see just her boss. Laura did not sleep well that night. It wasn't because of bills or deadlines or the quiet fear that lived in the back of every single parent's mind. It was because of a drawing lying on Daniel Carter's desk and the way he had looked at it like it was something more than a child's picture. There were moments in life when nothing had technically happened. And yet, everything felt different. Laura had learned to recognize those moments because they were usually followed by either very good news or very bad news. She just didn't know which one this was yet. The next few days settled into a strange new rhythm. Annie came to the office after school twice that week because Mrs. Brooks had physical therapy and couldn't watch her. Each time, Annie sat in reception with Mrs. Green, drawing or reading or asking questions that most adults were too busy to answer properly. And each time, sometime around lunch, Daniel Carter would appear in reception for a reason that was never clearly a reason. On Tuesday, he needed to review a document with Mrs. Green that could have easily been emailed. On Wednesday, he came out to ask if a package had arrived that his assistant had already placed on his desk an hour earlier. On Thursday, he came out with no explanation at all, stood there for a moment, and looked at Annie's newest drawing. This time, it was a fish. A fish, he asked. Annie nodded. Fish help when people are lonely. Mrs. Green made a soft sound like she might cry and covered it by rearranging papers that did not need rearranging. Daniel crouched slightly to look at the drawing better. That's a very serious fish. Yes, Annie said. It's a working fish. What does it do? It keeps people company and doesn't ask too many questions. Daniel nodded slowly. That's an excellent skill. From down the hall, Laura watched this through the glass wall of the conference room where she was setting up for a meeting. She told herself she should go get Annie, that Annie was probably talking too much, that this was a workplace and not a daycare, and certainly not a place for fish drawings and peanut butter sandwiches. But she didn't move because Daniel Carter looked different when he talked to Annie. Less like a man carrying a company on his back and more like someone who had set something heavy down for a few minutes without realizing it. That afternoon, Daniel called Laura into his office again. She walked in with her notepad, ready to take dictation, schedule calls, adjust travel plans, whatever he needed. That was the shape of their relationship. Clear, professional, predictable. But when she stepped inside, there were no files on the desk, no laptop open, just Annie's drawing and a small envelope beside it. Close the door, please, Daniel said. Laura closed the door and felt that strange feeling again, the one that said something was about to change. I've been reviewing department structures, Daniel said, sitting down behind his desk. And I realized something. Laura waited. You're still listed as Senior Administrative Support, he said. That title hasn't changed in 8 years. Laura nodded once. Yes, sir. You've been doing the work of an operations manager for at least 5, he continued. Probably longer. Laura didn't know what he wanted her to say to that. So, she said the safest thing. I just do what needs to be done. I know, he said. That's the problem. He slid the envelope across the desk toward her. Laura looked at it but didn't touch it. What is it? A new contract, he said. Title change, salary adjustment, official authority over internal operations, scheduling, and staff coordination. Laura stared at the envelope like it might disappear if she blinked. Why? She asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked instead at the drawing on his desk, the one with the 3 figures holding hands. Do you remember the week the company went bankrupt? He asked. Laura did not need to think about that. Yes, I had to let almost everyone go, he said. I remember the looks on their faces. Some of them were angry. Some of them were scared. Most of them left before I even finished the meetings. Laura said nothing. You came in the next morning like nothing had changed. He said. Same time, same coffee, same questions about my schedule. Laura remembered that morning very clearly. The office had been almost empty. Phones quiet, the cleaning crew louder than the employees. Daniel had looked like a man who had not slept in a week. You told me, Daniel continued, that as long as the lights were still on, there was still a company. And as long as there was still a company, you still had a job. And as long as you still had a job, I still had a schedule. And if I still had a schedule, then I still had a future. Laura looked down at her hands. She had forgotten she said that. Or maybe she had just never thought it mattered. I was just trying to keep things normal, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. You were the only one who did. The room was very quiet now. The kind of quiet that held old memories inside it. I don't forget people who stay when things fall apart, he said. I told you that the other day. I meant it. Laura looked at the envelope again, but still didn't pick it up. I don't want charity, she said. This isn't charity, Daniel replied calmly. This is me fixing a mistake I should have fixed years ago. She hesitated. People will talk. People already talk, he said. People always talk when a woman gets a promotion she earned. Laura looked up at that. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Take the contract home, he said. Read it. If you don't like it, we change it. If you don't want it, you say no. But the position is yours if you want it. Laura finally picked up the envelope, holding it carefully like it might be heavier than paper. Why now? She asked. Daniel glanced at the drawing again, then back at her. Because yesterday, he said, your daughter brought me a peanut butter sandwich so I wouldn't forget to eat, and I realized something was very wrong with a system where the most thoughtful person in the building is 6 years old. Laura let out a small breath that almost became a laugh, but didn't quite make it. She likes you, Laura said before she could stop herself. Daniel nodded once. I like her, too, he paused, then added quietly. She sees things very clearly. Laura thought about Annie's drawing. The 3 people holding hands in front of a building with too many windows. She thinks the world is small, Laura said. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he said, I think she just knows who belongs in it. Laura didn't have an answer for that. So, she did what she always did when things became too big and too personal and too important. She nodded once professionally and said, I'll review the contract tonight, sir. But when she left the office, she held the envelope against her chest for a few seconds before walking back to her desk. And for the first time in many years, Laura Bennett allowed herself to imagine a future that did not feel like survival. Down in reception, Annie was finishing another drawing. This one had 4 figures in it. When Mrs. Green asked who the 4th person was, Annie answered very simply, that's the fish I told you. It's a working fish. We're going to need it. On Friday afternoon, Annie decided that important people probably forgot things because they had too many big thoughts and not enough small ones. This was the conclusion she shared with Mrs. Green while sitting in the reception chair with her legs swinging and a box of crayons open beside her. What kind of small thoughts? Mrs. Green asked, playing along as she sorted the mail. Like lunch, Annie said. And fish. And when to go home. Mrs. Green smiled. Those are very important thoughts. Yes, Annie agreed. But important people think about buildings and money and sad things, so the small thoughts fall out. She demonstrated this by tilting her head and pretending something was falling out of her ear. Mrs. Green laughed, and at that exact moment, Daniel Carter stepped out of the elevator and saw the 2 of them. He paused for a second, watching Annie act out. Small thoughts falling dramatically onto the carpet. Am I losing small thoughts? he asked. Annie turned around in the chair. Yes, she said immediately. But it's okay. I brought extra. Mrs. Green turned away quickly so they wouldn't see her laughing again. Daniel walked over and looked at the paper Annie was drawing on. What is it today? Annie held it up. It was a drawing of a very large table with only one person sitting at the end of it. The table was covered in plates, but the person was alone. In the corner of the picture was a small girl standing very far away. And next to her was a woman. Between them and the man was a very large space. That's a very big table, Daniel said. Yes, Annie said. Too big. He nodded slowly. I see. You should get a smaller table, Annie continued. Then people would have to sit closer and they couldn't leave so fast. Daniel looked at the drawing for a long moment. That's a very strategic idea. I know, Annie said. I think about these things from the hallway. Laura watched again, that same complicated feeling in her chest. Gratitude, worry, hope, fear, emotions that did not sit comfortably together, but had all decided to live in the same place anyway. That evening, Laura stayed late to finish reviewing the new contract Daniel had given her. Most of the office lights were off now, and the cleaning crew had started on the lower floors. Annie was in Daniel's office again, this time. At the small table near the window, drawing quietly while Laura worked through numbers and job descriptions that looked very different from anything she had ever signed before. Operations Manager. The title alone made her nervous. She heard Daniel's door open behind her around 7:30. He had gone to another meeting and just returned. Annie looked up immediately. Hi, Annie said. I'm drawing a smaller table for you. Daniel set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. I appreciate that, he said. That should help with the small thoughts. Laura closed the contract folder and stood up. We're just finishing up. I'm sorry she's in here again. Daniel shook his head slightly. She's not exactly a disruption, he said. Most of the people I meet with draw much worse things than she does. They just use spreadsheets. Annie giggled because she didn't fully understand the joke, but knew it was a joke. Laura hesitated, then held up the folder. I read the contract. And Daniel asked. She took a breath. It's generous. It's accurate, he replied. It's a big change. You've been doing the job for years, he said. This just makes it official. Laura looked down at the folder, running her fingers along the edge. If I accept this, people will think they already think, Daniel said calmly. The question is whether you want to build a life based on what people think or what you know is true. Laura didn't answer right away. From the small table, Annie spoke without looking up from her drawing. Mom, she said, take the job. Laura blinked. Annie, honey, this is a grown-up conversation. I know, Annie said. But I live in the house, too. Daniel turned slightly so Annie wouldn't see that he was smiling. Laura sighed softly. Why do you think I should take it? She asked. Annie kept coloring. Because you're always tired. And when you're tired, you don't sing in the kitchen. And when you don't sing, the house feels smaller. Laura looked at her daughter and felt her eyes burn unexpectedly. That's not in the contract, Laura said quietly. It should be, Annie replied. Important jobs should come with more singing. Daniel looked down for a moment, then walked over to the small table and looked at Annie's drawing. It was the same big table from before, but now the table was smaller, and there were 3 people sitting close together on one side. On the other side of the table, Annie had drawn a small fish in a bowl. You added the fish, Daniel said. Yes, Annie replied. He's the quiet one. Daniel nodded. Every group needs a quiet one. He stood there for a moment looking at the drawing. Then he said something that surprised even himself. When I was 30, he said, I lost everything I owned. Laura looked up quickly. He had never talked about that in front of her. Not like this. I had a big house. He continued. A bigger office than this. A wife who liked expensive things, friends who liked expensive restaurants, and a company that looked very successful from the outside. He paused, then added. When the company went under, the house went, the friends went, and the wife went. The big table got very small very fast. Annie looked up at him, listening very seriously. Who stayed? She asked. Daniel looked at Laura. Your mom did, he said. Laura felt like the room had shifted slightly under her feet. I was just doing my job, she said quietly. No, Daniel said. You were staying when it was not a good investment. That's different. Annie thought about this, then nodded like she understood completely. That's why you have to stay now, she said to Daniel. Because mom stayed when you were sad. The room went very quiet. Daniel looked at Annie, then at Laura, and for the first time in many years, he said something without calculating the cost first. I'm trying, he said simply. On Monday morning, the building felt different, though nothing visible had changed. People still walked quickly through the marble lobby. Elevators still opened and closed with quiet efficiency. Men in suits still talked about markets, and women in heels still talked about schedules. Carter Capital was still Carter Capital, polished, expensive, and always slightly in a hurry. But by 10 o'clock, Laura understood what had changed. People were looking at her differently. Not openly, not rudely, but in that careful, polite way office people looked when news had traveled faster than confirmation. A few more good mornings than usual. A few conversations that stopped when she entered the break room. A few curious glances toward Daniel's office when she walked past. News didn't need to be announced in buildings like this. It leaked under doors and traveled in elevators and settled into coffee cups before anyone put it in writing. By 11, Mr. Thompson from the board had asked to see her. That had never happened before. Laura smoothed her blouse, told Annie to stay with Mrs. Green and not reorganize anyone's desk again, and walked to the conference room on the 39th floor where board members preferred to have quiet conversations that were not technically meetings. Mr. Thompson was in his late 60s with silver hair and the slow deliberate movements of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions that affected other people's lives. He stood when Laura entered, which surprised her. "Miss Bennet," he said kindly. "Please sit." "Thank you, sir." He studied her for a moment, not in a rude way, but in a measuring way, like he was trying to understand something beyond her job title. "You've been with this company a long time." He said. "Yes, sir." "You were here when Daniel lost everything." Laura nodded once. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." Walked slowly to the window and looked out over the city. "I was on the board back then, too," he said. "I remember that year very clearly. Banks don't like men who fail. Investors like them even less. Most people thought he was finished." Laura said nothing. Mr. Thompson turned back to her. "But you stayed." Laura gave the same answer she always gave. "I needed the job." Mr. Thompson smiled slightly. "That's what loyal people always say. They rewrite their own history so it sounds practical instead of brave." Laura didn't know how to respond to that, so she stayed quiet. He sat down across from her. "Daniel has recommended you for operations manager," he said. "The board will approve it. Officially, this is a promotion based on performance. Unofficially," he paused slightly, "it is also based on trust, and trust is much harder to measure." Laura felt her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "I understand, Mr. I." Thompson studied her for another moment. "Do you know why men like Daniel build big tables?" he asked suddenly. Laura blinked, surprised by the question. "No, sir, so they don't have to sit close enough for anyone to see who they really are." He said. "Success gives you space. Failure shows you who walks across the room and sits next to you anyway." He stood then. The conversation apparently finished. "You already had the job, Miss Bennet," he said. "The title is just catching up." When Laura left the conference room, her heart was beating faster than it should have been for a conversation that calm. Down in reception, Annie was sitting on the floor with a stack of paper. Mrs. Green beside her and Daniel Carter standing nearby with his sleeves rolled up holding a crayon. Laura stopped walking. Daniel Carter was holding a crayon like a man holding a very small, very confusing tool. "You have to press a little," Annie was telling him. "Not too hard or it breaks. This is purple. Purple is important." "I see that," Daniel said. "Seriously, what am I drawing?" "A fish," Annie said. "But a responsible fish, not a silly one." Mrs. Green saw Laura first and smiled. "We're very busy down here," she said. "Important design work." Laura walked closer slowly. "I can see that." Daniel looked up and for a brief second something in his expression changed when he saw her. Something that looked almost like he was relieved she was there. It was gone quickly, replaced by his usual calm. "Mr. Thompson and I had a talk," he said to her. "I know," Laura replied. "I just came from there." "And he asked." Laura held his gaze for a moment. He said, "The title is just catching up." Daniel nodded once. "He's a smart man." Annie held up Daniel's drawing. It was objectively a terrible fish. "This is a beginner fish," Annie explained to Laura. "But he's trying." "I can see that," Laura said. And this time she did smile. Annie suddenly looked between the two adults and narrowed her eyes slightly, the way children did when they noticed something no one had explained to them yet. "You both look less lonely when you're in the same room," she said matter-of-factly. Laura froze. "Annie, what?" Annie asked. "It's true. Before, Mom looked like she was carrying invisible groceries all the time, and Mr. Daniel looked like he was eating lunch in his head." Daniel turned his head slightly, hiding a smile behind his hand. Laura pressed her lips together, trying very hard to look like a professional adult and not a woman whose 6-year-old had just psychoanalyzed her boss. "Annie," Laura said carefully. "We don't say things like that at work." Annie thought about that. "Okay," she said. "Then I will say it at dinner instead." Mrs. Green made a choking sound that was definitely laughter. Daniel cleared his throat slightly. Annie, he said, your mom just got a new job. Annie's head snapped toward Laura. You did. Laura nodded slowly. Yes, I did. Annie stood up immediately and threw her arms around her mother's waist. That means more singing, she said into Laura's blouse. Laura closed her eyes for a moment and held her daughter. Yes, she said softly. That means more singing. Annie pulled back and looked at Daniel very seriously. Thank you, she said. Daniel looked slightly caught off guard. For what? For fixing my mom's tired. Annie said, I was trying with sandwiches, but this is better. Daniel looked at Laura then, and something passed between them that was quiet and complicated and not ready to be named. You're welcome, Annie, he said gently. Annie nodded, satisfied, and sat back down on the floor. Now we just have to fix Mr. Daniel, she said, picking up a blue crayon. Laura blinked. Fix him. Annie nodded. Yes, he still eats lunch alone and his table is too big and he doesn't have a fish yet. Daniel looked at Laura again and this time neither of them looked away right away. Outside the glass walls of Carter Capital, New York moved the way it always did, loud, fast, and full of people chasing something. Inside, on a quiet reception floor, a little girl was making a list of problems and solving them one by one with crayons, sandwiches, and the unshakable belief that lonely people were not supposed to stay lonely if she had anything to say about it. By the second week of Laura's new position, she began to understand something people never said out loud about promotions. The work didn't get easier. It got quieter. Before her job had been visible, phones ringing, schedules printing, people asking questions, problems arriving one after another like taxis. Now the problems arrived in emails marked confidential, in meetings behind glass walls, in conversations that started with the sentence, "This stays in this room." She worked longer hours, but she walked more slowly. People moved out of her way in the hallway now. Some smiled more, some smiled less. Respect and resentment, she was learning, often wore the same face from a distance. On Wednesday evening, she was still at her desk at nearly 7 when Annie wandered into her office carrying a book and a very serious expression. "Mom," Annie said, climbing into the chair across from her desk. "Are promotions supposed to make you more tired or less tired?" Laura leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "They're supposed to make you more responsible." "That sounds like more tired," Annie said. Laura laughed softly sometimes. "Yes." Annie opened her book but didn't read it. "Mr. Daniel is more tired this week, too," she said. Laura looked up. "You've seen him?" "Yes," Annie said. "He forgot lunch again on Monday, but on Tuesday I made him eat the apples from Mrs. Green's desk. Today he had a meeting where everyone looked like they were thinking mean thoughts." Laura studied her daughter. "What do mean thoughts look like?" Annie frowned slightly, trying to explain something complicated, like when people smile but their eyes are doing math. Laura didn't laugh this time. That was uncomfortably accurate. That same evening, Daniel was indeed in a meeting where people were smiling and doing math with their eyes. Victoria Hale sat across from him at the long conference table, elegant in a white suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was a partner at one of the most powerful corporate law firms in New York, and she had been working with Carter Capital for almost a year now. She was also, according to several business magazines, frequently seen at events with Daniel Carter, which was a polite way of saying the press had decided they were a future headline. Victoria closed a folder and slid it toward him. "If you sign this before the end of the quarter, the Hale merger goes through cleanly," she said. "No delays, no board resistance, no press complications." Daniel didn't open the folder. "And in return," Victoria smiled slightly. "In return, Carter Capital becomes twice its current size within 18 months. "That's the business return," Daniel said calmly. "I meant the personal one." Victoria held his gaze. "You marry me," she said simply. "And we become the most stable power partnership in this sector." There it was. Clear, polite, strategic, like discussing real estate or stock options. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "You don't love me," he said. Victoria didn't look offended. "Love is very unreliable," she replied. "Stability is not. And if I say no," she closed the folder gently, "then the merger becomes more complicated. Boards get nervous. Investors get cautious. Old financial history sometimes becomes interesting to journalists again." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. "You're threatening me with my own past," he said. "I'm reminding you," Victoria replied smoothly, "that the world is not kind to men who fail twice." There was a long silence in the room. Finally, Daniel stood. "I'll review the documents," he said. Victoria stood too. "Of course," she said. Then, as they walked toward the door together, she added lightly, "Oh, and Daniel, You may want to be careful about appearances. He looked at her. What appearances? I saw you in reception yesterday, she said, sitting on the floor drawing with a child. Her smile was still perfectly polite. People notice things like that, she continued. It confuses them. Daniel didn't answer. Companies like this run on confidence, she said. Not crayons. She walked past him and out of the room, her heels quiet and precise on the marble floor. Daniel stood there alone for a moment after she left, then looked down at the conference table, at the folder she had left behind. Marriage in exchange for business security, loneliness in exchange for power. A very large table, a very small life. That night, when he finally left his office, he found Annie asleep again, but this time not on his sofa. She was asleep in reception, curled up in the big chair with a blanket. Mrs. Green must have found somewhere. Her book had fallen open on her chest and a crayon was still in her hand. Laura was at the desk nearby, finishing an email. I tried to keep her awake, Laura said quietly. But it's been a long week. Daniel nodded and walked over to the chair. Annie's shoes were still on again, one untied. He shook his head slightly, almost smiling to himself. You're going to make a habit of this, he murmured. Very gently, he knelt down and untied her shoe, then the other, setting them neatly beside the chair. He adjusted the blanket a little so it covered her shoulders. Annie stirred slightly, then mumbled, still half asleep. Mr. Daniel, you forgot lunch again. Daniel let out a quiet breath. That might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so tired. Yeah, he whispered. I know. Her hand moved slightly off the chair. And without really thinking about why, he took it gently in his. I had a meeting, he whispered softly. It was about a very big table. Annie didn't wake, but her fingers curled around his. You need a smaller one, she mumbled. Daniel looked at the sleeping child, at the small hand holding his, and for the first time since Victoria had walked out of that conference room, the decision in front of him stopped looking like a business decision. It started looking like a life decision. On Thursday morning, Annie decided that Mr. Daniel was in trouble, not the kind of trouble where you go to jail and not the kind where you get yelled at. It was the quiet kind of trouble, the kind where a person stared at windows too long and forgot to finish their coffee. She noticed it at 9:12 a.m., which was when she arrived in reception with her backpack, her book, and a small container of cut apple slices that Mrs. Brooks had packed for her. Mr. Daniel walked past reception without seeing her. That had never happened before. He always saw her. Even when he was thinking about big things, he still noticed small things. That was one of the reasons Annie had decided he was a good man. Good men noticed small things, but today he walked past like the hallway was empty. Annie watched him disappear down the corridor toward his office, then looked at Mrs. Green. He's in trouble, she said. Mrs. Green glanced up from her computer. What kind of trouble? The quiet kind, Annie replied. Mrs. Green nodded slowly. She had worked in that building for 22 years. She knew exactly what the quiet kind of trouble looked like. Around lunchtime, Laura came down to reception with a stack of files and found Annie drawing again, but this time the drawing looked different. It was the big table again, but now there were only two people sitting at it, very far apart. In the middle of the table, Annie had drawn a large folder. On one side of the table was Mr. Daniel. On the other side was a tall woman with very straight hair and very sharp shoulders. Who's that? Laura asked gently. Annie kept coloring. The math eyes lady. Laura felt a small chill run through her. What math eyes lady? The one who came yesterday. Annie said. She walks like she already owns the floor. Laura knew exactly who she meant. Victoria Hale. Annie pointed at the folder she had drawn between them. That paper is a bad paper. She said if he signs it, he has to sit at the big table forever. Laura sat down slowly in the chair beside her. Annie, she said carefully. You can't understand business contracts from looking at people in hallways. Annie looked up at her. I don't look at papers, she said. I look at faces. Laura didn't know what to say to that. That afternoon, Daniel called Laura into his office again. But this time when she walked in, she immediately knew something was wrong. Not obviously wrong. The office was still perfect. The desk still clean. The city still stretched out behind him like he owned part of it. But Daniel himself looked like a man who had not slept well in several nights. You wanted to see me? Laura asked. He nodded and gestured for her to sit. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at the drawing Annie had left on the corner of his desk that morning. The one with the big table and the folder in the middle. Do you know what the most expensive mistake I ever made was? He asked finally. Laura shook her head slightly. No, sir. I thought success meant never needing anyone. He said I built my entire life around that idea. Big office, big table, big company. No one close enough to hurt me when things went wrong. Laura listened quietly. It worked. He continued right up until the day everything collapsed. And then I realized something. He looked up at her. If you build a life where no one can hurt you, you also build a life where no one can save you. The room was very quiet. Laura chose her words carefully. You rebuilt everything, she said. Yes, he said, but not alone. He held her gaze for a moment, and she understood what he was really saying without him saying her name. He looked back down at the drawing again. Victoria wants me to marry her, he said calmly. Laura felt like all the air had shifted in the room, but she kept her face still. I see. It would secure the merger, he continued. Stabilize the board, double the company in 2 years. That sounds like something the board would want, Laura said carefully. Yes, Daniel said, it does. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. When I was bankrupt, he said, I used to sit in an office much smaller than this one and eat sandwiches from a gas station and try to figure out how to start over at 30 years old. Everyone told me the same thing. Be smarter this time. Be colder. Don't trust anyone. He turned back to her. I did exactly that, he said, and I built all of this. He gestured slightly to the office, the building, the city beyond. And now, he said quietly, I have to decide if I'm going to spend the rest of my life protecting what I built, or finally building something I actually want to live in. Laura's hands were folded tightly in her lap. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. He walked back to the desk and picked up Annie's drawing, looking at the two small figures sitting far apart at the giant table. Your daughter thinks this is a bad deal, he said. Laura let out a small breath. My daughter thinks most things can be solved with sandwiches and fish. Daniel nodded slightly. She may not be wrong. He set the drawing down again very carefully. Laura, he said, and his voice was different now. Not boss to employee, not CEO to staff, just a man asking a question he had not planned to ask when he woke up that morning. If I choose the smaller table, he said, do you think there would be room for me? Laura looked at him. Really, looked at him, and for the first time she saw not the billionaire, not the CEO, not the man from magazine covers. She saw the man Annie had drawn standing a little awkwardly beside a woman and a child, like someone who wasn't sure he was allowed to be there but hoped someone might say yes. Laura swallowed. That depends, she said softly. On whether you're willing to stay when things are not easy. Daniel nodded once. I stayed once, he said. I can stay again. Outside the window, the city kept moving loud and fast and full of people chasing bigger tables. Inside the office, two adults stood very still, looking at a child's drawing, trying to decide what size life they were brave enough to choose. On Saturday, it rained again. New York in the rain always looked like it was remembering something. Old buildings turned darker, streets reflected pieces of sky, and people walked faster like they were trying to get back to somewhere that used to be important. Laura and Annie were at home that morning. Their small apartment filled with the smell of pancakes and the sound of an old radio Mrs. Brooks had given them 2 years ago. It sat on the kitchen counter and played soft music from a station that seemed to believe the world had stopped somewhere around 1987. Laura was standing at the stove flipping pancakes when Annie sat at the table drawing again. Her crayons spread out like a small colorful city. Mom, Annie said, do you think people know when their life is about to change? Laura smiled a little. No, she said, if they knew, they'd be too scared to let it happen. Annie nodded like that made sense and kept drawing. At that exact moment, 20 blocks away, Daniel Carter was standing in his kitchen holding a coffee he had reheated twice and not touched either time. His apartment was large, quiet, and perfectly organized in a way that suggested no one really lived there, only stayed. The dining table could seat 10 people. He had never used more than one chair. Victoria's folder was on the counter. He had brought it home the night before and had not opened it again. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside. Numbers, contracts, legal language that translated roughly into, you will never be alone again, but you will also never be free again. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray morning. For 10 years, he had made decisions based on recovery, on protection, on never going back to that year when the phone stopped ringing and the bank stopped pretending to be patient and his wife stopped pretending to believe in him. He had rebuilt everything carefully, like a man stacking glass. And now a 6-year-old girl with crayons was asking him to choose a smaller table. Around noon, there was a knock on Laura's apartment door. Laura frowned. Were you expecting anyone? She asked Annie. Annie shook her head and hopped off the chair. I'll check, Annie. Wait, Laura said, but Annie had already reached the door and opened it halfway. Daniel Carter stood in the hallway holding a paper bag that smelled like a bakery. He looked very out of place in Queens. Annie looked up at him, not surprised, just thoughtful. Hi, she said. You found our building. Yes, Daniel said. It took 3 wrong turns and a very patient doorman. Laura appeared behind Annie and stopped when she saw him. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to come without calling. He said. I was in the neighborhood. He was not in the neighborhood. Men like Daniel Carter were never accidentally in Queens. He held up the paper bag slightly. I brought lunch, he said. I remembered this time. Annie stepped aside immediately. You can come in, she said. But our table is small. Daniel looked at Laura. Laura hesitated only a second, then stepped back and opened the door wider. That's okay, he said. I'm here for the small table. Their apartment felt even smaller with him in it, but not in a bad way. He took off his coat and looked around like a man trying to understand a life very different from his own. There were drawings on the refrigerator, a small couch with a blanket folded over the back, books stacked in uneven piles, a pair of Annie sneakers by the door. This is where the singing happens, Annie told him. I see, Daniel said. They sat at the small kitchen table, Laura on one side, Annie on the other, Daniel at the end. The table was so small that their knees almost touched under it. Daniel set the bakery bag down and took out sandwiches and small pastries. I wasn't sure what you liked, he said. Annie looked into the bag. This is a very serious lunch, she said. They ate for a few minutes, the radio playing softly in the background. Then Annie looked at Daniel and asked the question she had clearly been saving. Are you going to marry the math-eyes lady? Laura nearly dropped her coffee. Annie, what? Annie said. It's a real question. Daniel didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. He looked tired. Yes, he said after a moment. That's what everyone thinks I should do. Annie studied his face very carefully. But you don't want to, she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel looked down at his coffee, then around the small apartment, at the drawings on the refrigerator, at the plant on the window, at Laura sitting across from him, trying very hard not to interfere in a conversation that was somehow bigger than all of them. No, he said quietly. I don't. Annie nodded like she had expected that answer. Okay, she said. Then don't. Daniel let out a small breath that sounded like something inside him had been held tight for a very long time. It's not that simple, he said. Annie shrugged. It is if you know which table you want. Laura looked down at her hands. Because suddenly this conversation felt too personal, too important, like they were standing at the edge of something that did not have a safe middle. Daniel looked at Annie. And which table do you think I want? He asked. Annie looked around the small kitchen, then pointed at the table they were sitting at. This one, she said. Because people can't leave without saying, excuse me. On Sunday night, after Daniel left their apartment, Annie made a new drawing. She didn't draw the big table this time. She drew the small kitchen table, the one with the scratch near the corner and the chair that made a small sound every time someone moved. She drew 3 people sitting close together. And this time, she drew the fish bigger in a round bowl in the middle of the table like it was part of the conversation. At the top of the page, she wrote in careful letters, small table is better. On Monday morning, Laura went to work with a strange feeling she could not name. It felt a little like hope and a little like fear, which were 2 emotions she had learned often arrived together. When she stepped onto the executive floor, she immediately felt the air was wrong. People were too quiet, not normal quiet, careful quiet. Mrs. Green looked up from reception and gave Laura a look that said something is happening. What is it? Laura asked quietly. Mrs. Green lowered her voice. Victoria Hale is here. She went straight into Mr. Carter's office. She's been there 40 minutes. Laura's stomach tightened slightly. Thank you, she said. From the reception chair, Annie looked up from her drawing. Math eyes lady? She asked. Mrs. Green nodded once. Annie looked down at her paper and started drawing the big table again. Inside Daniel's office, Victoria Hale stood near the window, perfectly calm, perfectly dressed, perfectly in control. I don't like being ignored, Daniel, she said. Daniel stood behind his desk, his hands resting lightly on the surface, his expression neutral in the way that had made him very powerful and very difficult to read. I'm reviewing the merger, he said. You're avoiding the decision, she replied. That's not the same thing. Daniel didn't answer. Victoria turned from the window and walked slowly toward his desk. I heard you spent your Saturday in Queens, she said lightly. That's a long way from your world. He held her gaze. It's closer to the one I want. Something sharp flashed in her eyes, but her smile stayed in place. You're making an emotional decision, she said. That's dangerous for a man in your position. I already made the dangerous decision once, he said calmly, 10 years ago. I trusted the wrong people because the deal looked perfect on paper. Victoria's smile faded slightly. This is not the same thing. No, Daniel said, it isn't. This time I know exactly what the deal costs. There was a long silence in the office. Finally, Victoria placed a folder on his desk and pushed it toward him. The board meets Friday night, she said. You sign before then and everything moves forward. You don't, and I can't guarantee what the board will do with old financial history. There it was again, the quiet threat, polite, professional, precise. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. You should also think about the example you're setting, she said without turning around. Companies like this are not run by sentiment, and men like you do not build empires by choosing small tables. She left without another word. Daniel stood alone in his office for a long time after she walked out. On his desk, Annie's new drawing lay beside Victoria's folder. Small table is better. He sat down slowly and looked at the two things in front of him. $1 billion merger and a child's drawing in purple crayon. A knock came on the door. Come in, he said. Laura stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Mrs. Green said, you wanted to see me. Daniel nodded and gestured to the chair, but he didn't sit right away. He walked to the window again like he needed the distance to say what he was about to say. The board meets Friday, he said. They expect me to announce the merger and the engagement. Laura felt the word engagement like a physical thing in the room, but she kept her voice steady. That sounds like a big night. Yes, he said, it is. He turned to face her. If I don't go through with it, the board may remove me as CEO. Legally, they can. I still own shares, but I may not control the company anymore. Laura didn't speak for a few seconds. When she did, her voice was very calm. Then you have to decide what matters more, she said. Being the CEO or being the man you can live with. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her like he was trying to memorize her face in case everything changed after Friday. That's a very expensive choice, he said. Laura nodded slightly. The important ones usually are. He walked back to the desk and picked up Annie's drawing, holding it carefully by the edges. She thinks this is simple, he said. Small table, people stay. End of problem. Laura allowed herself a small smile. Annie thinks most problems are people problems, not business problems. And what do you think? He asked. Laura met his eyes. I think, she said quietly, that business problems can be survived. But people problems, those are the ones that decide whether a life feels empty or not. Daniel looked down at the drawing again. Friday night, he said, there's a dinner with the board and investors before the meeting. Formal press will be there. Victoria will be there. Laura felt her chest tighten slightly but said nothing. I wanted you to hear it from me, he said. Before you heard it from someone else, she nodded once. Thank you for telling me. She stood to leave. But before she reached the door, Daniel spoke again. Laura, she turned. If I lose the company, he said slowly. I don't know what my life looks like after that. Laura looked at him for a long moment, then said the same thing she had told him 10 years ago in a nearly empty office when everything had fallen apart. As long as the lights are still on, she said softly, there's still a future. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten and settle at the same time. After Laura left, he looked once more at the two things on his desk. The folder, the drawing, big table, small table, power, people. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Carter understood that the most important decisions in his life were never really about money. Friday arrived slowly and then all at once. By late afternoon, Carter Capital had transformed into the kind of place that appeared in magazines instead of financial reports. The main conference hall on the executive floor had been rearranged for the evening dinner. White tablecloths, low candle light, glasses lined in perfect rows, staff moving quietly like part of a well-rehearsed performance. It was the kind of night where decisions were not just made, they were announced. Laura stood in her office adjusting the sleeve of her dark blue dress for the third time. She rarely attended events like this, but as operations manager, she was now expected to be present. That was the word Mr. Thompson had used, present. Not visible, not loud, not important, just present. The way people were present at moments that would be talked about later. Annie sat in the chair near Laura's desk, swinging her legs, wearing the yellow dress with the small white dots, the one she called her serious dress. Remember, Laura said gently, kneeling in front of her. You stay with Mrs. Green during the dinner. Quiet, polite, no running, no big speeches. I don't make big speeches, Annie said. Laura gave her a look. Okay, Annie admitted. Sometimes I make medium speeches. Laura kissed her forehead. Tonight, no speeches at all. Annie nodded. But she had the look on her face that meant she was thinking very hard about something. Across the building, Daniel stood in his office in a black suit, looking at himself in the reflection of the window instead of the mirror. The city behind the glass looked endless, full of light and movement, and people who would never know his name and would never care about the decision he was about to make. On his desk were two things, Victoria's contract folder and Annie's drawing of the small table. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said. Mr. Thompson stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The older man looked at the desk, at the folder and the drawing side by side, and nodded slightly like he understood everything without needing it explained. "Big night, Mr. Thompson said. "Yes," Daniel replied. Mr. Thompson walked slowly around the office, then stopped near the desk. He picked up Annie's drawing and studied it. "My grandson draws like this," he said. "Lots of sons, very optimistic," Daniel said. "Nothing." Mr. Thompson set the drawing down carefully. "Do you know what the problem with powerful men is?" he asked. Daniel glanced at him. "There are several." Mr. Thompson smiled slightly. "They forget that the people who sit at their big tables are usually there because of money. The people who sit at their small tables are there because of love, and only one of those groups will still be there when the money is gone." Daniel looked at the drawing again. "The board will vote tonight," Mr. Thompson continued. "If you go through with the merger and the marriage, everything is easy. If you don't, it will be uncomfortable for a while." "I know," Daniel said. Mr. Thompson nodded once. "I've been uncomfortable before," he said. "It didn't kill me. Regret almost did." He walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. "Whatever you choose tonight, Daniel, make sure it's a decision you can live with when the room is quiet and there's no one left to impress." Then he left. The dinner began at 7 o'clock. Men in dark suits and women in formal dresses filled the room with low conversation and careful laughter. Waiters moved between tables, refilling glasses, placing plates, removing plates. At the center table sat the board members, major investors, and Victoria Hale in a white evening dress that made her look like she had already won something. Laura stood near the back of the room with Mrs. Green and Annie, who was watching everything with wide, observant eyes. "Why is everyone talking so quietly?" Annie whispered. "Because rich people think loud voices are for emergencies," Mrs. Green whispered back. At exactly 7:45, Daniel walked into the room. The conversation softened immediately, like someone had turned down the volume of the entire space. He greeted investors, shook hands, nodded at board members, thanked people for coming. He did everything exactly the way a man in his position was supposed to do everything. Then he reached the main table and sat down in the empty chair beside Victoria. She smiled at him, calm and victorious. "I was beginning to think you might not come." "I said I would be here," he replied. Dinner lasted an hour. Business talk disguised as polite conversation. Numbers hidden inside jokes. Alliances disguised as compliments. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Thompson stood and gently tapped his glass. The room quieted. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Thompson said. "As you know, tonight we will be discussing the Hale merger and a personal announcement from Mr. Carter." All eyes turned to Daniel. At the back of the room, Annie stood very still beside Laura, her small hand holding the folded drawing she had made that afternoon. Daniel stood slowly. For a moment, he did not speak. He looked around the room, the board, the investors, the press near the wall, Victoria beside him, confident and composed. Then, without saying a word, he reached into his jacket and took out Annie's drawing. Not the contract, the drawing. He placed it on the table in front of him and smoothed it flat with his hand. "I was asked tonight to make a decision that would make this company bigger," he said calmly. "Safer, more powerful." He paused slightly. "But 10 years ago, I lost everything I had because I made a decision that looked good on paper and was wrong in real life." The room was completely silent now. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the drawing. "This week," he continued, "a 6-year-old girl explained something to me that no one in business school ever did." He looked up, his voice steady, but different now. More personal, more dangerous. "She said that if you sit at a small table, people can't leave without saying, 'Excuse me.'" There were a few confused looks around the room, a few small laughs that died quickly when they realized he was not joking. Daniel looked at the board. "So tonight," he said, "I am choosing the smaller table." And at the back of the room, Annie closed her eyes for 1 second like someone who had been holding her breath for a very long time. For a moment after Daniel said, "I am choosing the smaller table," no one in the room moved. It was the kind of silence that did not happen in business rooms. Business rooms were built on noise, voices, deals, polite laughter, the sound of people pretending decisions were easy. This silence was different. This silence meant something had just happened that could not be undone. Victoria Hale was the first person to move. She turned her head slowly and looked at the drawing on the table, then at Daniel. Her expression did not break, but something in her eyes hardened like glass cooling too quickly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm and clear enough for the entire table to hear. "I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying you're declining the merger?" Daniel met her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I am." A quiet wave moved through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, just a shift. People sitting straighter. People glancing at each other. People doing very fast math in their heads. Victoria folded her hands on the table. "You realize the board will not support that decision," she said. "Not after 6 months of negotiations." Daniel nodded. "I know. And you realize what this will do to your position here." "I know that, too." She studied him for a long moment like she was trying to find the man she thought she understood. "You're choosing sentiment over strategy," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "I'm choosing people over fear." That landed in the room differently. At the far end of the table, one of the investors cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said, "this is highly irregular. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Daniel looked at him calmly. "No," he said, "I think we should discuss it exactly here in public where decisions like this actually matter." He picked up Annie's drawing and held it lightly in one hand. 10 years ago. He said, "When my company collapsed, I sat alone in a room very much like this one and tried to figure out how I had built something so big and yet had no one left when it fell apart." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. "One by one, I told myself that if I ever rebuilt my life, I would do it smarter, colder, safer. And I did. I built a company that cannot be easily broken. I built systems and contracts and protections and exit strategies." He paused, and in the process I almost built a life that no one actually lived in. No one interrupted him now. Daniel placed the drawing flat on the table so everyone could see it. The small table, the 3 figures sitting close together, the fish in the middle. "This week," he said, "I was reminded that success is not the size of the table you sit at. It's who is still sitting there when the room is quiet." Victoria's voice was still calm, but the steel was back in it. "This is very poetic," she said. "But poetry does not run investment firms." Daniel looked at her. "No," he said, "but people do, and people are the only reason investment firms exist in the first place." One of the older board members leaned back in his chair. "If you walk away from this merger, we lose a significant expansion opportunity," he said. "The board has a responsibility to the shareholders and I have a responsibility to the life I am building." Daniel replied, "If the board believes I am no longer the right person to lead this company because of that, then we should have that conversation honestly." That was the moment everyone in the room understood what he was really saying. He was willing to lose the company. Victoria stood up slowly. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "And you're making it because of a child who draws pictures and a woman who works for you. That is not a rational basis for corporate governance." Daniel stood too. "No," he said, "I'm making this decision because 10 years ago when I had nothing, that woman stayed and helped me rebuild everything that everyone in this room now wants me to protect. And that child reminded me why it was worth rebuilding in the first place." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "You will regret this," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "regret comes from abandoning the people who stayed. I already learned that lesson once." Victoria picked up her glass, set it back down without drinking, and looked around the table. "Then I believe the board should vote," she said. Mr. Thompson spoke for the first time that evening. "We will," he said calmly. "But not tonight. Tonight was scheduled for an announcement, not a vote. And I think we have all received an announcement." There were a few quiet murmurs of agreement. Victoria looked at Mr. Thompson, then back at Daniel. She nodded once. A small, sharp movement. "This isn't over," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. She picked up her bag and walked out of the room without looking back. The room remained very quiet after she left. Daniel looked down at the drawing one more time, then folded it carefully and put it back into his jacket pocket. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said to the room, his voice returning to the calm, controlled tone everyone recognized. "I understand some of you may have concerns. My door is open tomorrow. We'll talk about the future of the company then." It was a dismissal, but a polite one. Slowly, people began to stand, to talk quietly, to leave in small groups, each conversation low and serious. At the back of the room, Annie was still holding Laura's hand. "Did he pick the small table?" Annie whispered. Laura looked toward Daniel, who was now speaking quietly with Mr. Thompson, his shoulders straighter than she had ever seen them. "Yes," Laura said softly. "He did." Annie nodded once, satisfied, like a project manager who had just watched a very complicated plan work exactly the way it was supposed to. "Good," she said. Now he just has to learn how to eat dinner on time and take weekends off. Laura laughed quietly through the sudden tightness in her throat. Across the room, Daniel looked up and met Laura's eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Everything was about to change. The company, the board, his position, their lives. But for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Carter looked like a man who had not lost something. He looked like a man who had finally chosen something. The next morning, Carter Capital looked exactly the way it always looked after a public disruption involving money. Beautiful, quiet, dangerous. The marble lobby still shone. The elevator still rose and fell with polished indifference. Men in navy suits still carried coffee and confidence in equal measure. But the building had the particular stillness of a place where everyone had read the same headlines before breakfast and was now pretending not to have opinions. Laura knew before she reached the executive floor that the story had already spread. Daniel Carter rejects Hale merger at investor dinner. No official statement yet, but sources confirm a split. Questions remain about board confidence. By the time the elevator doors opened, Mrs. Green was waiting behind reception with the face of a woman who had lived long enough to know when a storm had technically passed, but the trees were still in danger. "Good morning, Mrs. Green said. It was not a good morning. How bad?" Laura asked quietly. Mrs. Green glanced toward Daniel's office. 3 board members came in before 8. 2 investors have already called. Legal's been up there twice, and Mr. Carter hasn't had breakfast. Laura nodded. That last part felt irrationally like the worst detail. Annie, sitting in the big reception chair with a workbook on her lap, looked up. Did the small table make everybody mad? Laura bent and kissed the top of her head. Sometimes the right choice makes the wrong people uncomfortable. Annie considered that. That sounds expensive. It probably is, Mrs. Green said under her breath. At 9:15, Laura was called into the boardroom. The atmosphere inside felt less like a meeting and more like a trial in expensive clothing. Mr. Thompson sat near the center of the long table, composed as always. 2 other board members shuffled papers with the controlled impatience of men who preferred numbers to surprises. Daniel stood at the window, one hand in his pocket, tie slightly loosened, looking like a man who had already made peace with a difficult outcome and was now waiting to see if the world would punish him for it. Victoria Hale was not there. That worried Laura more than if she had been. "Miss Bennett," Mr. Thompson said. "Please sit." Laura sat. One of the board members, Richard Langley, opened a folder and got straight to it. "We are facing immediate instability," he said. "Hale Capital has suspended merger discussions. 2 large investors are requesting a formal confidence review and there are rumors, unpleasant ones, already circulating about Mr. Carter's judgment." Daniel did not move. Langley continued. "We need a plan by end of day, something concrete, something that assures the market the company is not being run on impulse." Mr. Thompson folded his hands. "Daniel has a plan," he said. That made Laura look up. Daniel turned from the window and walked toward the table. "Yes," he said, "I do." He placed a thin file in front of Langley. "Before Hale Capital approached us," he said, "I had begun a quiet review of our historical restructuring. Not because I doubted the numbers, because I doubted the story." Laura felt a small current of cold move through her. Langley frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said calmly, "that the collapse 10 years ago may not have been a market inevitability. It may have been assisted." The room changed. Mr. Thompson did not look surprised. That told Laura he already knew. Daniel continued, "There are irregular legal maneuvers in the bankruptcy transfer documents. Timing anomalies, accelerated debt calls through shell entities, later tied to firms with business connections to the Hale network." Langley sat back. "You're accusing Victoria Hale's family of engineering your collapse." "I'm saying the documents deserve investigation," Daniel replied. "And I'm no longer interested in pretending otherwise for the sake of convenience." Laura stared at him. This was bigger than rejecting a merger. This was war. Another board member, Ellen Pierce, spoke for the first time. "If you bring that allegation forward publicly without airtight proof, it becomes a liability nightmare." Daniel nodded. "That's why I'm not bringing it publicly yet. I'm bringing it here." He turned then and looked at Laura. "Miss Bennett was in the company during the collapse," he said. "She handled internal communications, calendar transitions, executive scheduling, and saw more than most people realize." Every eye in the room moved to Laura. She kept her posture still, though her pulse had begun to pound. Mr. Thompson spoke gently. "Laura, over the years, did anything ever strike you as off?" She thought back. That terrible season had lived in her memory like weather gray, relentless, full of urgent phone calls and men who stopped making eye contact. But underneath the panic had been details, small details. People underestimated secretaries. They always had. Yes, Laura said slowly. There were meetings that got cancelled before they were supposed to exist. Calls routed through outside counsel instead of direct executive lines. One law office in particular kept appearing before the debt acceleration notices came in. She looked at Daniel. Hale and Westcott Langley's expression changed. You remember that? Laura gave a small nod. I remember because it was strange. Everyone else started disappearing and that law firm kept getting faster access. Silence. Daniel slid another folder across the table. This one toward Laura. I had archives pulled this morning, he said. Old scheduling logs, visitor records, legal routing memos. I want you to review them. Langley looked irritated. You're involving operations in a historical legal matter. I'm involving the one person in this building who stayed the first time everything fell apart, Daniel said. And the one person I trust to recognize what does not belong. That landed heavily. Mr. Thompson's eyes rested on Laura with something like approval. Will you do it? Laura looked at the folder in front of her. This was not just an assignment. This was a door back into an old wound she had spent years teaching herself not to touch. Long nights, unpaid hours watching Daniel rebuild. From ash while pretending she herself wasn't also afraid. She had survived that chapter by treating it like finished history. Now it was opening again. Yes, she said. Daniel nodded once, not triumphantly, just gratefully. The meeting ended without ceremony. No one shook hands. No one pretended everything was fine. That was the thing about serious decisions. Once made, they moved quietly into the bones of a place. By noon, Laura was in a smaller conference room with the archives spread out in neat rows, visitor logs, legal transcriptions, call sheets, internal routing records, courier receipts. Annie sat at the far end of the table with crayons and strict instructions not to touch the grown-up papers. For nearly an hour, Laura read dates, times, names, patterns. The first thing she noticed was repetition. Hale and Westcott, Hale and Westcott, Hale and Westcott, not everywhere, just in the places where panic had accelerated. Right before the bank calls, right before the forced reviews, right before the bridge funding disappeared. The second thing she noticed was a handwritten note clipped to one schedule page from 10 years earlier. Not hers. Daniel's then chief counsel now dead. Move 430 with H&W before dead notice release. D doesn't need to know yet. Laura stared at the line until the room blurred. Mom. Annie's voice pulled her back. Laura looked up. Annie had stopped drawing. You look like when the toast burns, she said quietly. Laura swallowed. I'm okay, baby. Annie studied her face in the solemn way only children and very old people knew how to do. No, you're not. Laura pressed her fingers lightly to her temple and looked again at the note. Daniel stepped into the room a moment later, stopping when he saw her expression. What is it? He asked. Laura handed him the page without speaking. He read the note once, then again. Nothing visibly changed in his face, but the air around him sharpened. Annie looked between them. Bad paper, she asked softly. Daniel lowered the page. Yes, he said. Very bad paper. He sat down slowly across from Laura, the old document between them like a lit match. For 10 years, he said quietly. I thought I failed because I wasn't strong enough. Laura looked at him. You were set up. He gave one small humorless laugh. That would explain the timing. Annie slid off her chair and walked around the table. She placed one small hand on Laura's arm and the other on Daniel's sleeve as if keeping both adults from drifting too far into the past. You found it, she said. Daniel looked down at her hand. Yes, he said. Annie nodded. Good, because if someone broke your old table on purpose, they shouldn't get to sell you a new one. For the first time that day, Laura actually smiled. Daniel did too, though his eyes were still dark with the weight of what they had just uncovered. There it was, the shape of the truth, not complete yet, not courtroom ready, not safe, but real. And once truth became real, it had a way of demanding a public life. Daniel rose with the page still in his hand. Call outside counsel, he said to Laura. Not anyone with Hale connections. Independent forensic review, full document lock, chain of custody on everything in this room. Laura nodded, already reaching for the phone. He looked at Annie, then back at Laura. By tonight, he said, Victoria Hale is going to understand that this story is no longer hers to control. By 5 o'clock that evening, the building no longer felt merely tense. It felt divided. There were now two kinds of people inside Carter Capital. The ones pretending this was still a normal business crisis, and the ones who had already sensed that something much older and much more personal had cracked open beneath the polished floors. Laura could feel it in the hallways. People lowered their voices when she passed. Legal staff moved faster than usual. Assistants carried folders with the careful urgency of people who understood that paper could ruin lives as easily as it could build them. 3 different outside attorneys had arrived within the hour. None of them connected to Hale and Westcott, and all of them had gone straight into the secured records room with Daniel. Annie, meanwhile, was sitting in Laura's office with a grilled cheese sandwich cut into triangles, drawing what looked like a courtroom with a fish in the judge's chair. Laura glanced over from her desk. Why is the fish the judge? Annie didn't look up because fish are quiet and quiet people listen better. There was no energy left in Laura to argue with that logic. Her phone rang. It was Daniel. Can you come to my office? He asked. His voice was calm, but not in the usual way. This calm had weight behind it. I'm coming, Laura said. She walked Annie to Mrs. Green first. The older woman took one look at Laura's face and stood up immediately. I've got her, Mrs. Green said. Annie looked up from her drawing. Is this a grown-up storm? Laura nodded once. Yes, baby. Annie thought about that, then held out the purple crayon she was using. Take this, she said. For courage, Laura almost laughed, almost cried, and instead bent to kiss her forehead. She took the crayon and slipped it into her pocket like something sacred. Daniel's office door was closed when she arrived. Inside, the room was full. Mr. Thompson sat near the window, his hands folded over a cane Laura had never seen him use before. 2 outside attorneys were at the far end of the table. One older woman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. One younger man with a legal pad full of tight handwriting. Daniel stood behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking like a man who had been standing in that exact spot for a long time. On the desk were copies of the handwritten note, the visitor logs, the routing sheets, and a fresh report from the forensic review team. The silver-haired attorney turned toward Laura as she entered. Miss Bennett, we've been waiting for you. Laura took the empty chair nearest the desk. The attorney introduced herself as Margaret Ellison, lead counsel from a firm Daniel had used only twice before, both times when he wanted work done without leaks, theater, or compromise. Margaret pushed a marked-up timeline toward Laura. We've confirmed enough to establish probable coordination, she said. Not final proof for court yet, but more than enough to take to the board, freeze negotiations, and trigger a formal internal misconduct inquiry. Daniel looked at Laura. And enough, he said quietly. To confront Victoria, Laura's stomach tightened. Mr. Thompson spoke next. She's here, Laura turned sharply. Here in the building, Daniel said. She requested a private meeting 40 minutes ago. I told her I'd see her at 6 o'clock. Laura glanced at the clock on the wall. 5:38. Margaret folded her hands. Our advice is simple. Keep the conversation short. State what you know. State what happens next. Don't negotiate. Don't speculate. Don't threaten what you aren't prepared to do. Daniel nodded once. Understood. The younger attorney cleared his throat. One more thing. If Miss Hale realizes you are serious, she may try to reframe this as retaliation tied to your broken engagement. That's why corroboration matters. Miss Bennett's memory and records timeline are key. Laura sat very still. Daniel looked at her then, and something softened in his expression, just briefly. You don't have to be in the room unless you want to be. Laura understood what he was really offering. Protection, a way out, distance from the part of the storm that had her name in it. But 10 years ago, she had stayed when everyone else stepped back. And whatever this was now, it had been born in that old collapse. Yes, she said, I do. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded. At 5:58, Victoria Hale walked into Daniel's office without waiting to be announced. She was dressed in cream again, immaculate and self-possessed. Every detail of her appearance arranged to suggest control, but Laura noticed it immediately. The fraction of extra tension in her jaw, the way her smile came a second too late when she saw the room was not private after all. Well, Victoria said, glancing at the attorneys, at Mr. Thompson, then at Laura. This is dramatic. Daniel did not offer her a seat. We found the paper trail, he said. No preamble, no pleasantries. Victoria's eyes moved to the documents on the desk. I don't know what you think you found. Margaret Ellison slid a copy of the note across the desk toward her. You'll want to choose your next sentence carefully. Miss Hale. Victoria picked up the page. Laura watched the exact moment she recognized the handwriting and understood that the game had changed. It was tiny, barely visible. But it was there. She set the note down very carefully. This proves nothing, Victoria said. It proves enough, Daniel replied. Enough for the board. Enough for an independent investigation. Enough to suspend every pending arrangement tied to you or your family. Victoria laughed then, but it was a brittle sound. You're destroying a merger over a decade-old memo and some administrative logs. No, Daniel said, I'm destroying the lie that built it. Silence. Victoria's gaze shifted to Laura. Of all the looks Laura had seen from wealthy people over the years, this one was the oldest and ugliest, contempt sharpened by inconvenience. You, Victoria said softly. Of course, Laura met her eyes. You moved faster than anyone else the year he fell, she said. I remembered that before I knew why. Victoria's expression cooled even further. You were a secretary. Laura did not flinch. Yes, which is why no one noticed I was in the room. Mr. Thompson's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. Victoria looked back at Daniel. So this is what this is, she said. A moral awakening, a secretary, a child, and a billionaire deciding truth suddenly matters. Daniel's face changed then, but not with anger. With certainty. Truth always mattered, he said. I was just too damaged to look at it straight. Victoria took one step closer to the desk. And what exactly do you plan to do now? Hold a press conference. Tell the board you were manipulated by people smarter than you 10 years ago and emotionally compromised now. Margaret spoke before Daniel could. Our client will submit the evidence to the board within the hour. If your family's firms touch the debt acceleration structure, subpoenas will do the rest. For the first time, Victoria's confidence flickered. She recovered quickly, but Laura saw it. So did Daniel. You should leave the building. He said to Victoria, your access will be suspended pending review. Victoria stared at him. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Laura and back again. Then she smiled. But now the smile looked tired. This is not going to end the way you think, she said. Daniel's answer was quiet. No, he said it's going to end truthfully. That's enough. Victoria picked up her bag, looked once more at the documents on the desk, and walked out without another word. After the door closed, the room stayed silent for several seconds. Then, everyone seemed to breathe at once. Margaret began speaking immediately, outlining next steps, board notifications, document preservation, media protocols. The younger attorney started gathering the files into ordered stacks, but Laura barely heard any of it. The last 10 years had rearranged themselves in her mind in less than 10 minutes. So much shame, so much private rewriting, so many nights she had looked back on that collapse and told herself that maybe failure had just been bigger than honesty. Now there was another possibility. They had been betrayed, not outworked, not outsmarted. Betrayed. Daniel came around the desk after the attorneys left to call the board chair and stood in front of Laura. He seemed taller when he was tired, she noticed. Or maybe just more unguarded. You stayed again, he said quietly. Laura let out a breath that shook a little despite her best efforts. I told you, as long as the lights are still on, there's still a future, he finished. She nodded. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city glowed behind him in the evening dark, all cold glass and rain-slick light. But the room itself felt smaller now, closer, less like an office and more like the inside of a decision already made. Daniel looked at her with that same directness he brought to everything that mattered. When this is over, he said, I want to make something very clear. Laura's pulse quickened. You will never work in this building as someone invisible again, he said. Not to me, not to the board, not to anyone. She searched his face, unsure whether she was hearing a professional promise or something more personal wrapped carefully inside it. Maybe it was both. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out Annie's purple crayon drawing from the investor dinner, and set it gently on the desk between them. The small table, the 3 figures, the fish. I don't know exactly what comes next, he said. The board could still force changes. The press will be ugly for a while. There are probably harder days ahead before there are easier ones. Laura looked down at the drawing, then back at him. And she asked softly. Daniel's voice lowered. And I'm asking anyway. He paused like a man who had negotiated billion-dollar terms with less caution than this single moment. When the noise settles, he said, I would like you and Annie to stay in my life. Not because I owe you. Not because of what happened 10 years ago. Because somewhere along the way, the two of you became the part of it that feels most like home. Laura's eyes burned before she could stop them. She laughed once under her breath. Not because it was funny, but because it was either that or cry. Daniel, she said, the name unfamiliar and right at the same time. That is not a small thing to ask. No, he said, it isn't. She looked again at the drawing on the desk, a smaller table, people close enough to matter. Then she looked at the man standing in front of her, no longer asking for safety. Only honesty. Then don't leave when it gets difficult, she said. His answer came without hesitation. I won't. And in the hall outside, faint but unmistakable, Annie's voice could be heard asking Mrs. Green. Did the bad paper lose? Laura closed her eyes for 1 second. Smiling through tears, she was finally too tired to hide. Not yet, she thought. But it was starting to. By Monday morning, the headlines had changed. They were still about Daniel Carter, still about Carter Capital, still about the failed merger and the suspended access of Victoria Hale, but the tone had shifted. What had begun as gossip in tailored language was becoming something else now. Questions, investigations, unnamed sources, legal reviews, a board under pressure to respond to more than embarrassment. Truth, Laura was learning, moved slowly until it didn't. The executive floor was quieter than usual, but no longer with the careful tension of people hiding something. It was the quiet of people waiting to see what honesty would cost. At 9 to 10, Daniel called a full board session. At 9:15, Laura stood just outside the conference room with a folder in her hands and Annie beside her in a navy cardigan, white tights, and serious black shoes that made her feel, in her own words, like a tiny lawyer. Mrs. Green had offered to keep Annie in reception, but Annie had folded her arms and announced that if grown-ups were going to finish the bad paper problem, then she wanted to be near the ending. So she sat outside with colored pencils and a sketch pad, watched over by Mrs. Green and Mr. Thompson, who had taken a surprising interest in Annie's opinions on fish. Inside the conference room, the final evidence was presented cleanly and without performance. Independent counsel had confirmed enough financial overlap and legal sequencing to justify a full inquiry. The board could not ethically continue any relationship with the Hale network. The merger was dead, Victoria's access remained suspended. External investigators would proceed. The room was not triumphant. It was something better than that. It was honest. When the vote came, it came without drama. Daniel would remain CEO pending completion of the inquiry. Mr. Thompson, backed by two of the older board members and one investor who disliked scandal more than uncertainty, framed it simply. If the company survived betrayal once, it can survive the truth now. Laura heard the vote through the closed doors only as a murmur and the scrape of chairs. But when Daniel emerged nearly an hour later, she knew before he said anything. He looked tired. He also looked lighter. Annie stood up immediately. Did the bad paper lose? Daniel looked down at her. And for the first time in days, the answer came with a real smile. Yes, he said, it did. Annie nodded once, deeply satisfied. Good, because it was rude. Mr. Thompson laughed out loud at that, a warm, old-fashioned laugh that filled the hallway and made everyone else breathe easier. By noon, the building began returning to itself. Phones rang. Meetings resumed. Assistants moved quickly again, but now with relief instead of strain. Even the light through the windows seemed different, brighter over the wet silver of the city. Laura spent most of the afternoon cleaning up the logistical damage of the past 72 hours. Rescheduled appointments, reassigned legal access, internal memos, media protocols, 3 separate requests from investors asking for private reassurance. It was the kind of work she was good at. Precise, invisible, if done well. Chaos only noticeable in its absence. At 4:30, Daniel appeared at her office door holding 2 things. A small glass bowl and a paper bag from a pet store. Laura looked up slowly. What is that? Daniel stepped inside. A life decision, he said. Annie, who had been drawing on the floor with Mrs. Green's permission and several stolen binder clips, gasped so dramatically that Laura turned before Daniel could answer. No, Annie whispered. You got the fish. Daniel held up the bag a little. I was informed this was a critical next step. Annie shot to her feet. Was he expensive? Daniel considered that emotionally probably. Laura laughed despite herself. Daniel set the bowl carefully on the corner of her desk. Inside the bag was a small plastic container with a bright blue fish swimming in tight circles. Bewildered, but elegant, Annie clasped both hands over her mouth. He's beautiful. He was labeled low maintenance, Daniel said. I took that as a challenge. Laura leaned back in her chair and looked at the fish, then at Daniel, then at Annie, nearly vibrating with joy. You actually did it, she said. Daniel met her eyes. I said I was staying. The words were simple, but they settled in the room like something far older than romance and far stronger than charm. Annie looked between them, then declared, he needs a name. Of course he does, Laura said. Annie stared into the bowl with enormous seriousness. His name should be Justice. Daniel blinked once, then nodded solemnly. Strong choice, because he's small, Annie explained. But he's still one. No one in the room had a better argument than that. At 6 o'clock, after the last calls were finished and the final email sent, Daniel asked Laura and Annie to wait. For what? Laura asked as she slipped on her coat. For dinner, he said. Annie looked immediately hopeful. At the small table, Daniel nodded. At the small table, they took the elevator down together just as the fish carefully carried in his temporary container by Annie with the seriousness of a child transporting a national treasure. Daniel drove them himself, not to a restaurant in Midtown with white tablecloths and a reservation made by assistants, but back to Queens, to Laura's apartment, where the kitchen light turned the windows gold and the radio still worked only when tapped twice on the side. Daniel carried in a bag of groceries like a man who had done it before, though Laura suspected he had not. Bread, salad, tomatoes, soup, a pie from the bakery downstairs near Carter Capital, and fish food. You bought fish food before asking if the fish could stay here? Laura asked. Daniel set the bag on the counter. Optimism, he said. Annie placed Justice in the center of the small kitchen table in his new bowl and sat down across from him. There, she said. Now nobody is lonely. Laura stood at the stove warming soup while Daniel sliced bread at the counter slightly too carefully, as if good bread required legal precision. For a few minutes, the apartment filled with ordinary sounds. Bowls clinking, a knife on wood, Annie telling Justice the important parts of the past week so he could understand the family timeline. It was such a small thing, Laura thought. Such an ordinary thing, and maybe that was why it felt so extraordinary. No grand speech, no photographer, no board approval. Just 3 people in a queen's kitchen and a blue fish named Justice. When they finally sat down, the table really was too small for elegance. Knees brushed. Annie had to pass the bread basket twice because there was nowhere else to put it. Daniel's sleeve nearly dipped into the soup once, which Annie corrected immediately. Small tables require focus, she told him. I'm learning that, he said. Laura looked at the two of them, at Annie's bright face and Daniel's tired, patient one, and felt something inside her soften in a way it had resisted for years. She had spent so long building life around survival that she had forgotten there could be another structure, one built not on escape routes and backup plans, but on presence, on who came back, on who stayed when staying cost something. Daniel looked at her across the fishbowl, and perhaps because the room was small and the hour quiet and the hardest part already behind them. He said the thing without dressing it up. I meant what I said, he told her, about wanting you and Annie in my life. Laura held his gaze. I know, she said. Annie looked up from feeding Justice exactly 3 pellets. Good, she said, because I already put you in the next drawing. Daniel smiled. Did you? She nodded and reached for the paper beside her plate. She had been working on it between spoonfuls of soup. She turned it around and pushed it into the center of the table. There they were, Annie, Laura, Daniel, and Justice in his bowl. All 4 of them crowded around the small kitchen table under a bright yellow sun far too large for an evening scene. At the top, in careful block letters, Annie had written, Our table. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Laura did too. Then Annie, with all the certainty of the very young and the very wise, placed her small hand in the middle of the table. Daniel put his hand over hers. After only the slightest pause, Laura laid hers on top, and with Justice circling quietly between them, the radio humming low, and the city moving beyond the window like it always had and always would, the table no longer felt small at all. It felt exactly the right size for a life worth staying in. This story reminds us that true worth is not measured by power, money, or the size of the table we sit at, but by the people who choose to stay when life falls apart. It teaches that loyalty, kindness, and quiet courage matter more than appearances, and that real justice often begins with simple honesty through Annie's innocence, Laura's faithfulness, and Daniel's choice to value people over fear. The story shows that healing begins when we stop building walls around our pain and start making room for love, truth, and human connection. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.